I wouldn't let my mom clone my dog, and she lost her entire mind. You need to give me Mackerel right now so I can get him cloned because I deserve to have a dog exactly like yours, my mom said, pushing into my apartment with syringes and scalpels while my golden retriever wagged his tail at her. Mom, you can just adopt a golden retriever from the shelter. I blocked her from my confused dog. I want Mackerel specifically, but I'm a good person, so instead of taking him, I'm just gonna do a biopsy today and send it to that lab in Korea, she said, waving a brochure for a pet cloning company. Either you let me clone him or I'll take him while you're at work and do it myself, my mom said. Then she tried to grab Mackerel, but he ran into the bedroom. 2 weeks later, she sued me for intentional infliction of emotional distress and theft of emotional property, claiming that my refusal to clone Mackerel was depriving her of her rightful companion animal. She'd hired a lawyer who argued that grandparents' rights should extend to granddogs, and she demanded court-ordered access to Mackerel for DNA harvesting. She brought 30 pages of photos showing how happy Mackerel looked and how empty her house was without an identical copy of him, plus testimony from her friends saying she'd been devastated since I wouldn't share my dog's genome. The judge dismissed it immediately, but she filed appeals claiming discrimination against aspiring pet owners. She contacted every cloning lab in the world trying to get them to steal Mackerel's DNA without my permission, and one actually sent representatives to evaluate the situation. After months of failed legal attempts, she showed up at the dog park while I was playing fetch with Mackerel, accompanied by 6 identical golden retrievers she'd bought from different breeders. She'd dyed their fur to match Mackerel's exact coloring and trained them all to respond to his name, announcing to everyone at the park that she'd successfully cloned my dog 6 times using advanced visualization techniques and maternal manifestation. She released all 6 dogs at once, saying they were all Mackerel's clones, and I couldn't tell which was the original, causing complete chaos as 7 golden retrievers ran in different directions. When I grabbed the real Mackerel who came to my specific whistle, she tackled me screaming that I was stealing one of her clones, and she sicked the other 6 dogs on us, trying to create so much confusion that she could swap one for the real Mackerel. She then completely lost it, and decided to transform herself into Mackerel's mother, by injecting herself with dog hormones she'd bought from underground veterinary suppliers. She took canine fertility drugs meant for breeding programs and artificial dog pheromones, convinced she could grow mammary glands that would make Mackerel recognize her as his biological mother. She injected herself with growth hormones meant for show dogs and testosterone blockers used for aggressive breeds, documenting everything on social media as her transformation into Mackerel's true mother. She surgically implanted fur under her skin that she'd been collecting from Mackerel's brushing sessions, and it immediately got infected and started rotting. She took pills meant to help dogs digest raw meat and gave herself tapeworms trying to share Mackerel's microbiome. Then she started eating actual dog food and drinking from bowls on the floor to prepare her body for motherhood. She had her teeth filed into canine points and got hair transplants all over her body using her own hair to create fur, but her immune system rejected everything, and she went into septic shock. The hospital found her with kidney failure from the dog hormones, infected wounds from the fur implants, and severe malnutrition from eating nothing but kibble for 3 weeks straight. You made me transform myself because you wouldn't just clone Mackerel properly, she told me from her hospital bed while getting dialysis. I have permanent organ damage because you couldn't share one simple dog with your mother. You injected yourself with veterinary hormones and implanted fur under your skin, I said. But my dad told me to have compassion. If you'd given me Mackerel's DNA like a good daughter, I wouldn't be dying from kidney failure at 58 years old. My mom sobbed while the entire family surrounded her bed glaring at me. I still had Mackerel but couldn't take him anywhere because the entire city knew me as the woman who drove her mother to destroy her body over a dog. Local news ran segments about the poor mother in organ failure whose selfish daughter wouldn't perform a simple DNA swab, and they interviewed crying relatives who said I'd always been cold and withholding. The veterinary board was investigating my clinic for contributing to her access to animal medications, even though she'd stolen them, and protesters stood outside my practice with signs saying I valued a dog over my mother's life. The sheriff knocked on my door this morning with animal control, and they had a warrant to seize Mackerel for the safety of the community, until my mom recovered enough to properly share custody. I opened the door wider and saw the sheriff holding official paperwork, while the animal control officer stood behind him with a catch pole and leash. "Ma'am, we have a court order to remove the dog from your custody pending investigation," the sheriff said, pushing the warrant toward me. I grabbed the paper and scanned it quickly, my hands shaking as I read words like immediate danger, and public safety concern, and temporary protective custody. Mackerel pressed against my leg, whining softly as he sensed something was wrong, his tail tucked between his legs. The warrant claimed I was mentally unstable, and that Mackerel posed a danger to the community based on sworn statements from my mother about aggressive behavior and neglect. "This is insane. He's never hurt anyone," I said, but the sheriff just shifted his weight and told me I could contest it at the hearing. The animal control officer stepped forward with the leash, and I realized I had no choice unless I wanted to get arrested for obstruction. My hands trembled as I clipped Mackerel's leash to his collar, telling him it would be okay, even though I didn't believe it myself. He looked up at me confused, his brown eyes searching my face as the officer took the leash from my shaking fingers. They led him toward the white van parked outside, and he kept looking back at me, pulling against the leash and whimpering. The protesters who'd been camping outside my building started cheering and clapping as they loaded my dog into the cage in the back. "Justice for the mother!" someone shouted while others took photos with their phones. The animal control officer handed me a yellow carbon copy form with a hearing date in 2 weeks, and the address of the municipal shelter. I watched the van drive away with Mackerel's face pressed against the back window, his golden fur visible through the metal grate. Back inside my apartment, I collapsed on the floor where Mackerel's bed usually sat, the indent in the carpet still visible from where he slept every night. I pulled out my phone and started calling every lawyer in the directory, getting voicemail after voicemail or secretaries saying they didn't handle animal custody cases. The seventh lawyer I called, Curtis Yu, actually answered his own phone and listened to my whole story without interrupting. "I've seen this before, family members using the legal system as a weapon," he said, sounding tired but interested. He agreed to meet me that afternoon to review the warrant and start building a defense. Curtis arrived at my apartment 2 hours later with a briefcase and legal pad, immediately asking to see all the documentation. He read through the warrant carefully, highlighting sections and making notes in the margins. "Your mother claimed you're mentally unstable and that Mackerel attacked her, but there's no police report or medical records attached," he said. "The community safety angle was weak," he explained, "but animal control had to respond given my mom's hospitalization and all the media coverage making me look like a monster." My phone buzzed with texts from my clinic staff, and I opened the messages to see photos of protesters blocking the entrance with huge signs. "Animal abuser," and "Daughter from hell," and "She values dogs over mothers" were painted in red letters. My head technician texted that 3 appointments had already canceled, and she was getting death threats on the clinic's social media pages. Someone had posted my work schedule online, and people were planning to confront me during every shift. My phone rang and Dad's name appeared on the screen, so I answered even though I knew what was coming. "Just give your mother what she wants, so she'll stop refusing her dialysis treatments," he said immediately. I tried explaining that giving in to emotional blackmail wouldn't actually help her mental health, but he cut me off. "You're killing her with your selfishness," he said, then hung up before I could respond. Curtis watched me put down the phone and made more notes on his legal pad. The next morning, Curtis filed an emergency motion to return Mackerel pending the hearing, arguing the seizure lacked probable cause and was based on false statements. The judge's clerk called 3 hours later to say the motion was denied, but the hearing would be moved up to next week. Curtis said that was actually good news since it meant less time for my mom to build her case. I drove to the municipal shelter that afternoon, desperate to at least see Mackerel and let him know I hadn't abandoned him. The receptionist called for the supervisor, and Valentina Bates came out looking apologetic but firm. "I'm sorry, but during contested seizures we can't allow visitation from any party," she said, though her expression suggested she thought this whole situation was ridiculous. She walked me back outside and quietly mentioned that Mackerel was doing okay, but seemed confused and wasn't eating much. That evening, a certified letter arrived from the veterinary board announcing a formal investigation into how my mother accessed controlled substances from my clinic. They wanted inventory records, security footage, and documentation going back 6 months, all to be provided within 30 days. The letter warned that failure to comply could result in suspension or revocation of my license. Curtis came over again and we spread everything out on my kitchen table, creating a timeline of my mom's behavior. "Document everything from now on," he said, pulling out his phone to show me apps for recording calls and backing up texts. He explained that emotional abuse cases needed paper trails, especially when the abuser was playing victim so publicly. We spent 3 hours organizing every text, email, and voicemail my mom had sent over the past year, printing them out and putting them in chronological order. The stack grew to over 200 pages, and Curtis said we'd need every single one for court. I stayed up past 3 in the morning going through my clinic's computer system, pulling security logs from the past 2 years. The records showed something worse than I expected. Mom had used her spare key 17 times after hours, always between midnight and 4 a.m., when she knew nobody would be there. Each visit matched up with missing inventory I'd blamed on counting errors or staff mistakes. She'd taken ketamine, propofol, antibiotics, even surgical supplies that had no use outside a medical setting. I printed every access log, every inventory discrepancy report, every security camera timestamp showing her car in the parking lot at weird hours. My phone buzzed at 7 a.m. and I saw Gia's name for the first time in months. She was crying before I even said hello. "I can't watch Mom do this to you anymore," she said from her dorm room 3 states away. She'd been following Mom's social media posts where she called me a monster and posted photos of herself hooked to dialysis machines. Gia wanted to write a statement about all the times Mom had pulled similar stunts when we were kids. She remembered when Mom faked cancer to stop me from going to vet school, claiming she needed me home for treatments that never existed. She remembered the time Mom sued our neighbor for emotional damages because their cat liked visiting our yard more than staying home. She said she'd email everything to Curtis and would fly home if needed for court. 3 days later, the veterinary board investigator showed up at my clinic without warning. She checked every lock, tested every alarm, reviewed every camera angle while making notes on her tablet. She spent 2 hours going through my controlled substance logs, comparing them to DEA records and state requirements. "Your security was reasonable before these incidents," she said carefully. She explained that anyone with a key could access the drugs since I hadn't anticipated family members breaking in at night. She warned that any gaps in my new security system could mean losing my license to practice. Curtis called that afternoon with bad news. Mom had filed 3 more lawsuits in different counties, each claiming different types of abuse and neglect. One said I'd stolen her emotional support animal, another claimed elder abuse, the third accused me of intentional infliction of emotional distress. "She's trying to drain your money through legal fees," Curtis explained. He said defendants often gave up and settled just to stop the bleeding of lawyer costs and court appearances. Each lawsuit would need separate responses, separate hearings, separate legal strategies that would cost thousands. The expedited hearing came 5 days later at the county courthouse. Mom rolled in using a wheelchair she didn't need, pushing an IV pole with a saline bag for show. Her lawyer argued that I was withholding critical emotional support property from a dying woman. He actually used the phrase canine custody, like Mackerel was a child in a divorce case. He showed photos of Mom in the hospital, claiming her health was declining without access to her dog. Curtis quietly showed me Mom's medical records from the hospital showing her kidney function was already back to normal ranges. When my turn came to testify, I explained the break-ins at my clinic, showing the security footage and inventory reports. I described finding her in my clinic at 2 a.m., filling a bag with veterinary drugs worth thousands of dollars. I showed photos of the infected fur implants, the filed teeth, the rejection sites where she'd tried to transform herself into a dog. The judge looked sick as I explained how she'd injected herself with canine hormones meant for breeding programs. He asked why I hadn't reported the thefts earlier, and I admitted I'd hoped to handle it as a family matter. He seemed frustrated that I'd let it escalate this far without police involvement. Valentina took the stand next, explaining Mackerel's condition when they'd seized him. She said he showed zero signs of abuse or neglect, just confusion about being separated from his owner. She'd examined hundreds of animals over 20 years and had never seen a case based on grandmother's rights to a dog. She actually said the whole situation was unprecedented and frankly absurd, before the mom's lawyer objected. The judge reviewed everything for an hour while we sat in silence. Finally, he announced he needed more time and more information before making a decision. He ordered psychological evaluations for everyone involved and set another hearing for 2 weeks out. Mom started screaming that I was killing her with delays while Dad wheeled her toward the exit. He wouldn't look at me as they passed, keeping his eyes on the floor like he was ashamed of all of us. That night, Mom sent 47 text messages to my phone. They started with guilt about her medical bills, shifted to rage about losing in court, then detailed exactly how she'd destroy my veterinary practice. She said she'd burn it down. She'd report me for every possible violation. She'd make sure I never worked with animals again. Curtis filed for a restraining order the next morning using the texts as evidence. 2 more of my clinic staff quit that week, unable to handle the protesters and death threats. My head technician lasted 1 more day before saying she couldn't risk her own license by association. I worked 12-hour shifts alone, just trying to keep up with existing patients who still trusted me. The protesters got worse every day, blocking the parking lot and screaming at anyone who tried to enter. Local news kept running segments about the heartless veterinarian who valued a dog over her dying mother's wishes. My phone rang while I was cleaning up broken glass from another rock thrown through my clinic window. Dinah's name showed on the screen and I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. She started talking fast about how she'd been watching Mom do the same thing since they were kids. She said Mom faked cancer when their parents wouldn't buy her a horse at 12 years old. She made herself throw up for weeks and told everyone she had tumors until Grandma caught her with Ipecac bottles. Dinah said she'd testify about all of it because she was tired of watching Mom destroy people to get what she wanted. She had photos of Mom's fake wheelchair from when she wanted sympathy at their cousin's wedding. She had medical records showing Mom's pattern of made-up illnesses whenever someone told her no. I wrote down everything while Dinah listed 20 more examples going back 40 years. The next morning, I sat in a small office while a court-appointed therapist asked me questions for 3 hours straight. She wanted to know about every family dinner and every birthday, and every time Mom had acted strange. I told her about the time Mom pretended to have a heart attack when I wouldn't let her move in with me. I described how Mom would call ambulances whenever Dad disagreed with her about anything. The therapist wrote pages of notes and kept nodding like she'd heard this before. She warned me that family court usually wants people to work things out even when one person is clearly unstable. She said judges hate taking sides in family fights and usually push for compromise no matter how crazy the situation gets. That afternoon, I got a call from the breeder who sold me Mackerel 5 years ago. She sounded upset and said Mom had been calling her every day for 2 weeks. Mom offered her $50,000 for information about Mackerel's litter mates or any genetic relatives. The breeder said Mom wanted DNA samples from any of Mackerel's siblings to create her own clone. She'd recorded the calls because Mom started threatening to sue her for discrimination against desperate grandmothers. Curtis called me that evening with news that made everything make sense. He'd been checking Mom's lawyer's credentials and found out the guy was actually Mom's cousin from Florida. The cousin wasn't even licensed to practice law in our state and had been disbarred in Florida 3 years ago. We filed a complaint with the Bar Association that night, which meant all of Mom's legal filings might get thrown out. Curtis said this could end everything if the judge found out Mom had been using a fake lawyer. 2 days later, I had to sit through a mediation session the court had ordered before the next hearing. Mom rolled in with her IV pole even though Curtis had proof she didn't need it anymore. She said she'd drop all the lawsuits if I just gave her Mackerel on weekends and Wednesdays. The mediator actually started writing this down like it was reasonable until Curtis pulled out Mom's psychiatric records. He showed the mediator 3 different doctors saying Mom had severe personality disorders and couldn't be trusted with animals. The mediator stopped writing and said we'd have to let the judge decide. After the mediation, Valentina pulled me aside in the courthouse hallway. She said she'd been doing this job for 20 years and had seen enough families use animal control as a weapon. She was going to recommend returning Mackerel in her official report because this whole case was wasting everyone's time. She said Mom was clearly using the system to harass me, and animal control had real abuse cases to handle. She'd already written her report saying Mackerel showed 0 signs of neglect and should go home immediately. The veterinary board sent their decision letter 3 days later while I was treating a sick cat. They issued an official warning but no suspension since my security had been reasonable before Mom started breaking in. They said I had to install biometric locks that only I could open within 30 days. They wanted cameras covering every inch of the clinic and all drugs in a safe that recorded who opened it. The new security would cost $15,000, but at least I could keep working. That night, Mom posted a video from her hospital bed that went viral in 6 hours. She cried about how I wouldn't let her say goodbye to Mackerel before she died from the organ damage. She said I was heartless and begged anyone watching to help her see him one last time. The comments filled up with people offering to break into my apartment and steal Mackerel for her. Someone posted my home address and said they'd already scoped out the building's security. Another person said they worked at the animal shelter and would grab Mackerel if he got brought in. Curtis called the next morning to say the prosecutor's office had been watching Mom's case. They were considering charging her with theft of controlled substances and burglary for the clinic break-ins. He said criminal charges would change everything because Mom couldn't manipulate criminal court like family court. The prosecutor wanted to see all our evidence and would decide within the week about filing charges. The follow-up hearing was set for that Friday, and Mom's cousin lawyer never showed up. The Bar Association had sent him a cease and desist letter, and he'd gone back to Florida. Mom tried to speak for herself, but kept rambling about grandmother rights that didn't exist. She couldn't explain any legal reason why Mackerel should stay at the shelter. The judge looked tired and said he'd review everything and make a decision at the next hearing. The following week we were back in court, and the judge spent 20 minutes reading through Valentina's report about how stupid this whole thing was. He flipped through the psychological evaluations that said Mom had narcissistic personality disorder, with delusional features, and couldn't be trusted with animals. Dinah had sent a 10-page letter describing Mom's pattern of fake medical emergencies whenever she didn't get her way since childhood. The judge looked exhausted as he ordered Mackerel returned to me immediately, but said Mom could have one supervised visit per month at the animal shelter. Mom started screaming about her rights as a grandmother while Dad tried to calm her down. Curtis handed me the court order and told me to go get my dog right now before Mom tried something else. I drove straight to the municipal shelter where Valentina was waiting with Mackerel in the lobby. He jumped on me crying and shaking, his ribs showing through his fur from the stress of being locked up for weeks. His golden coat was dull and matted, and he wouldn't stop whimpering as I held him. Valentina helped me carry him to my car because his legs were too weak from not exercising. She warned me that Mom would definitely violate the visitation order based on what she'd seen in 20 years of this job. I wrapped Mackerel in his favorite blanket and drove him straight to my clinic to check his health. He'd lost 8 pounds and had stress colitis from the shelter food. The next morning, Dad texted that Mom had been discharged from the hospital with completely normal kidney function. The doctors couldn't explain how her organs had recovered so fast once she lost the court case. She was already planning to appeal everything, and had contacted 3 new lawyers who specialized in grandparents' rights. Dad said I should prepare for round 2, because she wasn't giving up on getting Mackerel. I spent the weekend looking for a new apartment since Mom knew where I lived. I found a complex with keycard entry, security cameras, and a doorman who checked IDs. The property manager had seen the news coverage about the crazy cloning mother, and approved extra safety measures for my unit. She gave me a panic button that connected directly to security, and put my apartment on a no-visitor list. Curtis met me at my clinic to file civil suits against Mom for the stolen veterinary supplies and damage to my reputation. He said we wouldn't win much money, but it would establish legal boundaries she couldn't cross without facing jail time. We documented every broken lock, missing drug vial, and canceled appointment from the protests. The paperwork took 4 hours and cost me another $2,000 in legal fees. 3 weeks passed without any contact from Mom, and I started to relax. Then she showed up at my clinic with a film crew claiming she was making a documentary about elder abuse in America. She had a cameraman, sound guy, and someone holding a boom mic as she narrated about her heartless daughter who wouldn't share a simple dog. Security dragged her out, but not before she'd filmed herself crying in my waiting room. The video went viral again with people calling me a monster for not letting my dying mother see Mackerel. My clinic got review bombed and someone spray-painted dog hoarder on my car. 2 days later, Curtis called to say the prosecutor had formally charged Mom with theft of controlled substances and burglary. The state was pressing charges whether I wanted them to or not, because she'd stolen scheduled drugs that could be sold on the street. Dad begged me to convince the prosecutor to drop everything because criminal charges would destroy our family. I explained that I didn't file the charges and couldn't stop them even if I wanted to. He said Mom would never forgive me for letting her go to prison over a dog. The prosecutor had security footage of Mom breaking into my clinic 17 times and stealing ketamine, tramadol, and other controlled substances. They found her fingerprints on the drug safe she'd tried to break into with a crowbar. Gia called that night to say she was transferring from her college to our local university. She couldn't stand being 3 hours away while everything was falling apart, and wanted to support me through this mess. She said watching Mom's manipulation on social media had made her realize how toxic our family had always been. She'd been in therapy at the school and finally understood that Mom's behavior wasn't normal or acceptable. She was moving back next month and would testify about Mom's history if needed. Mom's first supervised visitation with Mackerel was scheduled for a Tuesday morning at the shelter. I had to drop him off and leave while Mom spent an hour with him under Valentina's supervision. Within 10 minutes, Valentina called to say the visit was over because Mom had brought scissors and tried to cut Mackerel's fur. She'd hidden them in her purse and pulled them out when she thought Valentina wasn't looking. The supervisor grabbed them before she could get any fur and immediately ended the visit. Valentina recommended to the court that all future visits be suspended for Mackerel's safety. Mom left screaming that she just wanted a small DNA sample, and we were all conspiring against her. I picked up Mackerel, who was hiding under Valentina's desk and shaking. That afternoon, I had my first therapy appointment to deal with the guilt and anxiety from everything. The therapist listened to the whole story without interrupting and then said Mom's behavior wasn't my fault or responsibility to fix. She explained that Mom had trained our whole family to give in to her demands through emotional manipulation and fake crises. Setting boundaries wasn't cruel. It was necessary for my own mental health and safety. 3 weeks later, Curtis called to say Mom had worked out a plea deal with the prosecutor, where she'd plead no contest to reduce charges of misdemeanor theft and get 2 years probation with mandatory psychiatric treatment instead of jail time. The judge at her sentencing made it clear that any violation would mean immediate incarceration, and Mom actually nodded like she understood while Dad held her hand in the courtroom. I watched from the back row as she signed the probation papers with a shaking hand, and the bailiff explained she'd have monthly drug tests and weekly therapy sessions, plus she couldn't come within 500 feet of my clinic or apartment. Over the next few weeks, my clinic started getting real clients again, instead of just protesters, and the review bombing stopped after Curtis sent cease and desist letters to the worst offenders. Former clients started calling to reschedule appointments they'd canceled during the media circus, and 3 of them actually apologized for believing what they'd seen on the news without asking for my side of the story. My head technician came back after finding out the truth about Mom's break-ins, and we hired 2 new assistants to handle the increased workload as word spread that my practice was open again. Curtis spent an entire Saturday at my apartment helping me set up a legal trust for Mackerel that would prevent any cloning attempts even if something happened to me, and we filed the paperwork in 3 different states to make sure it couldn't be challenged. The documents specified that Mackerel's DNA couldn't be harvested or used for any reproductive purposes, and that his remains would be cremated immediately upon death with no tissue samples retained. We even added a clause that any attempt to clone him would result in immediate forfeiture of any inheritance from my estate, which Curtis said was probably overkill, but better safe than sorry. Dad surprised me by calling to say he'd started seeing a therapist himself after realizing he'd been enabling Mom's behavior for their entire 35-year marriage. He admitted he'd always given in to her demands to avoid conflict, and was learning how to set boundaries even though Mom was fighting him on every single change he tried to make. The therapist had him practicing saying no to small requests first, like when Mom wanted him to drive her places she could get to herself, or when she demanded he call relatives to complain about me. 6 months after the whole nightmare started, Mom's probation officer called to update me that she was actually taking her prescribed medication and attending all her therapy sessions without missing any. She hadn't tried to contact me directly, which the officer said showed real progress since most people with her issues couldn't resist testing boundaries, especially with family members. The medication was helping with her obsessive thoughts, and the therapist was working on her narcissistic tendencies, though that would take years to really address. Valentina called the next week to check how Mackerel was doing, and mentioned that Mom had shown up at the shelter trying to adopt 6 golden retrievers at once, claiming she was starting a therapy dog program. They'd run her name through their system and found the flag from her previous incident, so they couldn't approve any adoptions without clearance from her psychiatrist, which she didn't have. Mom had gotten angry and accused them of discrimination, but left when Valentina threatened to call her probation officer about the harassment. A month later, I got an invitation to speak at the state veterinary conference about protecting practices from family exploitation and maintaining professional boundaries with relatives who expect special treatment. The organizer said my story had spread through the veterinary community, and dozens of vets had similar experiences with entitled family members stealing supplies or demanding free services. I gave a 40-minute presentation to 200 vets about documentation, security measures, and the importance of pressing charges, even when family pressure makes it feel impossible. Gia started driving down every other week so we could have dinner together and actually talk about rebuilding our relationship without Mom's chaos constantly disrupting everything. She brought her new boyfriend to one dinner, and he made a joke about how our family drama made his parents' divorce look like a peaceful meditation retreat, which made us both laugh for the first time in months. We talked about growing up with Mom's manipulation, and how we'd both developed different coping mechanisms with Gia, becoming the peacekeeper who avoided conflict, while I'd become the one who pushed back. 9 months into her treatment, Mom's therapist reached out to say Mom had written me a letter, taking actual responsibility for her actions without blame shifting or manipulation tactics. The therapist read it to me over the phone because Mom wasn't allowed direct contact yet, and it included real apologies for the break-ins, the theft, the lawsuits, and trying to destroy my business. The therapist said this represented genuine progress, though she recommended maintaining the no-contact boundary for at least another year to solidify the behavioral changes. 2 weeks later, my practice won a Small Business Resilience Award from the Chamber of Commerce for surviving the negative publicity and rebuilding after the crisis. The award came with a $1,000 prize and a feature article in the local business journal that helped restore my professional reputation after months of being known as the evil daughter who wouldn't clone her dog for her dying mother. 3 weeks after the award, I signed up Mackerel and me for therapy dog certification classes at the community center. The instructor tested Mackerel's temperament by dropping metal pans behind him and having strangers grab his paws and tail while he stayed calm through everything. We practiced walking through wheelchairs and walkers without getting tangled in medical equipment, while elderly residents at the practice facility petted him and fed him treats. After 6 weeks of classes and evaluations, we got our certification cards and started visiting Sunset Manor Nursing Home every Tuesday afternoon. The residents would wait in the common room with their faces lighting up when Mackerel trotted in wearing his red therapy dog vest. One woman who hadn't spoken in months, according to the staff, started telling Mackerel stories about her childhood dog, while scratching behind his ears. Another resident, who usually stayed in his room, would come out just to throw tennis balls down the hallway for Mackerel to fetch. The activities director said she'd never seen the residents so engaged and asked if we could come twice a week, but I could only manage Tuesdays with my clinic schedule. Dad called asking if we could meet for coffee at the shop downtown where we used to go when I was in high school. He showed up 10 minutes early and already had my usual order waiting at the corner table by the window. He started by saying he'd been going to therapy himself and realized how much he'd enabled Mom's behavior over the years by always making excuses for her. He said watching her destroy her body with those dog hormones finally made him see how dangerous her obsessions had become. He apologized for not stepping in when she started breaking into my clinic, and for telling me to have compassion when she was manipulating everyone from her hospital bed. We sat there for 2 hours talking about boundaries, and how he was learning to say no to her demands, even when she cried or threatened to hurt herself. He said family dinners were off the table for now, but maybe we could do coffee once a month to slowly rebuild things between us. Curtis started texting me jokes about the whole situation after our legal work wrapped up, and we'd grab lunch sometimes when he was near my clinic. One day over sandwiches, he said we should write a book about the whole insane experience because nobody would believe it actually happened. He pulled out his phone and showed me notes he'd been keeping about the strangest parts, like when Mom brought 6 golden retrievers to the dog park, or when she tried to argue for grand dog rights in court. We laughed about how the judge's face looked when Mom's cousin lawyer tried to cite cases about emotional support peacocks on airplanes as precedent for forced dog cloning. Curtis said his law school friends still asked him about the case at conferences because it had become legendary in municipal law circles. 6 months into her court-ordered treatment, Mom's psychiatrist called to update me on her progress since I was listed as a family contact. The psychiatrist said Mom had been diagnosed with narcissistic personality disorder, obsessive-compulsive disorder, and a delusional disorder that explained her belief that she deserved to own Mackerel. The combination of proper medication and intensive therapy was helping her recognize how her behavior had hurt people, though she still struggled with taking full responsibility. The psychiatrist said Mom was responding better to treatment than expected, and might be ready for supervised family contact in another year if she kept improving. Almost exactly a year after everything started, I got married in my friend's backyard with just 20 people there. Gia flew in to be my maid of honor, and Mackerel wore a little bow tie as the ring bearer, carrying the rings in a pouch on his collar. My new husband had been so patient through all the family drama, and never once suggested I should just give in to keep the peace. During the ceremony, Mackerel sat perfectly still next to us except for his tail wagging when we said our vows. Mom sent a card through Dad respecting my request for no contact, but wishing me happiness in my marriage, which felt like huge progress from where we'd started. My practice had been doing so well that I needed to hire another vet to handle the patient load. During the interview, I was completely upfront about the family boundary issues and explained our new security protocols, including biometric locks and restricted access lists. The new vet thanked me for being honest about potential family drama, since her last job had problems with the owner's relatives showing up demanding free services. We implemented a policy where all staff had to document any family members who might try to access the clinic, and everyone had to sign agreements about not sharing access codes even with relatives. Valentina called one afternoon to tell me Mom had applied to volunteer at the animal shelter, but needed approval due to her history. Mom was following all the rules during her supervised shifts, cleaning kennels and filling water bowls without trying to adopt any dogs or asking about cloning services. Valentina said Mom seemed genuinely committed to helping the animals and hadn't mentioned Mackerel once during her 4 weeks of volunteering, which everyone considered a miracle. 5 months after the wedding, I moved into a house with an actual backyard where Mackerel could run around without a leash. My friend with a female golden retriever had planned a litter and asked if I wanted Mackerel to be the sire, so now we had an 8-week-old puppy who looked exactly like Mackerel did as a baby. Mackerel would drop tennis balls in front of the puppy, trying to teach him to play fetch, while the little one just chewed on them instead. Sitting on the back porch watching them play in the grass felt like the normal, peaceful life I never thought I'd have again after Mom's breakdown. Hey, thanks for letting me wander through all this with you today. That was a fun ride. I really appreciate you sticking around. I'll see you next time. If you made it to the end, drop a comment. I love reading all your comments.